I knew something was wrong the moment my daughter-in-law smiled too sweetly across the Thanksgiving table. I'm Margaret Whitmore. I'm 67 years old, and I have hosted more Thanksgiving dinners than I can count. But this year I was a guest in my own son's home, sitting at the far end of a long oak table in suburban Ohio, while a 20-pound turkey steamed under the chandelier and the windows fogged from the warmth inside against the 38-degree November air outside. I had woken up at 5 that morning to bake my pecan pie from scratch, the same recipe I've used for over 40 years, wrapped it carefully in foil, and driven 20 miles with it on the passenger seat like it was something fragile and alive, because that's what traditions feel like to me, alive and worth protecting. Ashley greeted me at the door with a hug that felt rehearsed, her perfume light and floral, her voice bright enough to carry into the kitchen where my son Daniel was carving the turkey, and she thanked me for coming as if I were an invited neighbor instead of the woman who raised her husband. The house looked perfect, every throw pillow in place, every candle lit, the grandchildren running in socks across the hardwood floors, and for a moment I told myself that maybe this year would be easier, that maybe the tension I sometimes felt was only in my imagination. We sat down to eat, plates heavy with stuffing and mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce passed from hand to hand, and Ashley lifted her glass to say how grateful she was for family, for togetherness, for everyone doing their part. And I nodded along, smiling politely, because at my age you learn how to smooth over small discomforts for the sake of peace. Halfway through dinner, just before dessert, she reached for a small cream-colored envelope beside her plate and said, "Before we have pie, I have something for Mom." Her tone light, playful, the kind people use before announcing a party game. She slid the envelope across the table toward me, and I remember how the room seemed to quiet just a little, how even the clink of silverware paused as it stopped in midair. I picked it up, noticing my name written in careful script, and I told myself it might be a thank you note, maybe a family photo. From earlier that afternoon, something sentimental. Inside was a card with printed words that made my cheeks grow warm. Family trip fund. While we're away, please help by deep cleaning the house. It's the least you can do since you're staying here. There was a small smiley face drawn in the corner, as if that could soften the meaning. I read it twice to be sure I understood, the letters steady and unmistakable, and when I looked up, Ashley was watching me with that same polished smile, while Daniel focused very hard on rearranging his fork. No one laughed. No one said it was a joke. In that moment, surrounded by the scent of turkey and cinnamon and the soft hum of forced gratitude, I realized I was not being included in this family. I was being assigned a role, and it was not the one I thought I had earned after a lifetime of giving everything I had. The rest of the evening moved forward as if nothing unusual had happened, and that was what unsettled me the most. Ashley clapped her hands lightly and said we should not let the food get cold, and Daniel finally looked up just long enough to ask who wanted more gravy, his voice steady, almost cheerful. I folded the card carefully and slipped it back into the envelope, placing it beside my napkin as though it were simply another holiday greeting, because I refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing my hands shake. My grandchildren began talking about a beach trip in Florida planned for early December, describing white sand and hotel pools and room service breakfasts, and I listened quietly as the pieces fit together. The card was not a joke. It was an assignment. They would be gone for 7 days, and I was expected to stay behind in their 4-bedroom house and scrub baseboards, wash windows, and reorganize closets like hired help. When dessert was served, Ashley thanked me for the pecan pie, but added that next time I could use less sugar since they were trying to eat healthier, and everyone chuckled softly in that polite way families do when something is slightly uncomfortable but not dramatic enough to challenge. I excused myself to the kitchen to fetch more coffee, and as I stood at the counter pouring it into delicate white cups, I remembered the down payment I had given them 5 years ago, $30,000 from the savings your father and I had built over decades. I remembered the months I spent babysitting when their youngest was born so they would not have to pay for daycare that cost $250 a week. I remembered repainting their guest room myself last spring because Ashley said she did not trust contractors to do it properly. Standing there with the coffee pot in my hand, I realized that somewhere along the way, generosity had quietly been redefined as obligation. When it was finally time to leave, I hugged my grandchildren tightly and told them to enjoy the ocean, and I thanked Ashley for hosting such a beautiful dinner. She walked me to the door and reminded me that she would leave a detailed cleaning list on the refrigerator, her tone casual, as if she were reminding me to water a plant. Daniel kissed my cheek and said he would call me later, but he did not meet my eyes. The cold air outside felt sharper than before, and as I drove the 20 miles back to my own 3-bedroom home, the streetlights blurring slightly through the windshield, I felt something settle inside me. It was not anger, not exactly. It was clarity. For years I had believed that staying quiet was the same as keeping peace. That night, for the first time, I understood that silence can also be permission, and I was no longer willing to give it. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had anywhere to be, but because my mind refused to rest. The house was quiet, the kind of deep quiet that only comes after a holiday, when the world seems to pause before returning to its routines. I made myself a cup of black coffee and stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the thin layer of frost covering my backyard, and I replayed every second of the night before. The envelope, the careful handwriting, the way Ashley had said the word help as if it were generous. I walked to my desk and took out the folder where I keep important papers, the deed to my home, my retirement account statements, the insurance policies your father and I paid into for decades. For years, I told myself that everything I had would one day make Daniel's life easier. That is what mothers do. We build safety nets long after our children believe they are standing on their own. But as I looked at those documents spread across my dining table, something shifted in me. I realized that generosity, without boundaries, does not create gratitude. It creates expectation. Around 10 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Ashley. She had sent a detailed cleaning schedule, broken down by day, with bullet points about scrubbing tile grout, polishing stainless steel appliances, and washing all bedding in hot water. At the bottom, she added a cheerful line about how grateful they would be to come home to a sparkling house. I read it once, and then set the phone down without replying. I thought about the years I spent working double shifts at the local hospital cafeteria to help Daniel pay for community college. I thought about how proud I was when he landed his first real job, how I cried quietly in my car because I believed every sacrifice had led to that moment. I never imagined that decades later I would be treated like an unpaid housekeeper in the very family I helped build. By noon, I had made a decision that felt both terrifying and peaceful. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Henderson, the estate planning attorney your father and I had worked with years ago. His receptionist recognized my name immediately and offered me an appointment the following week. As I wrote the date and time on my calendar, I felt something steady return to my chest. I was not acting out of anger. I was acting out of clarity. That afternoon, when Daniel finally called to ask if I had received the list, I told him calmly that I had, and that we would talk soon. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for the first time in a very long while, I did not rush to fill it with reassurance. The appointment with Mr. Henderson was scheduled for Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon, and in the days leading up to it, I moved through my routines with an unusual sense of awareness, as if I were seeing my own life from a small distance for the first time. On Saturday, Ashley sent another message reminding me that they would be leaving early Friday morning for the airport and that the spare key would be under the flower pot by the garage. She added a smile and a note about how much the children were looking forward to swimming in 80-degree weather while Ohio turned colder. I read her message slowly and then placed my phone face down on the kitchen table. I did not reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and began researching something I had postponed for years: independent senior living communities within a 20-mile radius of my home. I had always told Daniel that I would eventually move closer to them so I could help more, so I could be available, so I could make their lives easier. That afternoon, I toured a community 15 minutes away, a quiet place with brick buildings, walking paths, and a dining hall that smelled of fresh bread. The monthly fee was higher than I expected, but I had the savings. I always had the savings. I simply never chose to spend them on myself. As I walked through a model apartment with wide windows and a small balcony, I imagined what it would feel like to live somewhere that did not treat my presence as a favor to be repaid. The following Tuesday, I sat across from Mr. Henderson in his office, the same office where my late husband and I once planned for a distant future that suddenly felt very present. I explained calmly that I wanted to revise my will, that I wished to establish a charitable donation in your father's name to the local community college, and that I wanted to restructure how, and when Daniel would receive anything at all. Mr. Henderson did not ask for dramatic explanations. He simply nodded and said that clarity later prevents conflict sooner. When I left his office with a folder of updated documents, I felt lighter, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I was finally protecting myself. On Friday morning, instead of driving to Daniel's house to wait for their departure and pick up cleaning supplies, I drove to the senior living community and signed a deposit for a one-bedroom unit available in January. That afternoon, as Ashley's family boarded their flight to Florida, I placed their printed cleaning schedule in my drawer at home and poured myself a cup of tea. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I allowed myself a small, private smile, because I understood something now that I had not understood before. Respect is not requested through lists and reminders. It is demonstrated through action, and I was about to demonstrate mine. They returned from Florida on a Sunday evening, and I knew the exact moment their plane landed because Ashley sent a message that read, "We are home. Hope the week went smoothly," with a small palm tree emoji at the end. I looked at the clock on my kitchen wall, 7:43 in the evening, and imagined them unlocking their front door, stepping inside with suitcases still warm from baggage claim. I pictured Ashley walking straight into the kitchen, expecting to see polished countertops and gleaming floors. Instead, she would see exactly what she left behind a week earlier, not dirtier, not cleaner, simply untouched. I did not answer her message that night. I went to bed at 10 as usual, after reading a few chapters of a novel I had borrowed from the library, and I slept more peacefully than I had in months. The next morning, my phone rang at 8:15. It was Daniel. His voice was controlled but tight, the way it used to sound when he was a teenager trying not to admit he was upset. He asked if I had been feeling well, if something had come up, because the house was not cleaned. I told him calmly that I was feeling very well, and that nothing had come up at all. There was a pause, long and heavy. He reminded me about the list, about how they had counted on me. I replied that I had seen the list, and that after careful thought, I realized I had misunderstood my role. I told him I was his mother, not his employee, and that I believed we needed to have a different kind of conversation soon. He did not argue. He simply said he would call back later. That afternoon, Ashley finally sent her own message, less cheerful than before. She wrote that she was disappointed and that family should support one another. I read her words slowly, noticing how support, in her language, meant labor without question. I responded with one sentence. I agree that families should support one another, which is why we need to redefine what that means. I did not elaborate. Instead, I spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through closets in my own home, deciding what I would bring with me when I moved in January. I set aside old photo albums, your father's watch, and the handwritten recipes that carried the story of my life far better than any cleaning schedule ever could. For years I believed that love required endurance, that the price of staying close to my son was swallowing small humiliations and pretending they did not sting. But as I folded sweaters into neat stacks and labeled donation boxes for the local church, I felt something steadier growing inside me. It was not anger. It was self-respect. And for the first time since that envelope slid across the Thanksgiving table, I understood that sometimes the most powerful response is not raised voices or dramatic exits. Sometimes it is the quiet decision to step out of a role you never agreed to play. Daniel came by 3 days later without calling first, which told me more than his words ever could. I saw his car pull into my driveway just after 4 in the afternoon, headlights cutting across the bare maple tree in my front yard, and I took a slow breath before opening the door. He stepped inside with that familiar mixture of confidence and uncertainty I used to see when he was a boy who knew he had done something wrong, but hoped his charm would smooth it over. He began by saying that Ashley felt embarrassed, that she had only meant the cleaning list as a practical solution, that everyone was overwhelmed and thought I had more free time now that I was retired. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded neatly in my lap, and when he finished, I asked him a simple question. I asked whether he truly believed it was appropriate to assign his mother a week of unpaid labor in a house she helped finance. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked around my living room, at the framed photographs of his childhood baseball games, at the bookshelf your father built 30 years ago, and I could see the memory flicker across his face. He said he did not want conflict. I told him neither did I, but avoiding conflict is not the same as avoiding disrespect. I explained that in January I would be moving into a senior living community 15 minutes away, that I had already placed a deposit, and that I intended to focus on my own life instead of revolving around theirs. His eyes widened, not with anger, but with surprise. He asked why I had not told him sooner. I answered that I had been waiting for the right moment, and that sometimes clarity arrives quietly. I also informed him that I had updated my estate plans. I did not share every detail, but I made it clear that my assets would now reflect relationships built on mutual respect, not expectation. For the first time in our conversation, he sat back and truly looked at me, not as a resource, not as a safety net, but as a woman making her own decisions. He said he never meant for me to feel used. I told him that intention does not erase impact. We spoke for nearly an hour, calmly, without raised voices, and when he finally stood to leave, he hugged me longer than he had in years. As I closed the door behind him, I did not feel victorious. I felt steady. There is a difference. Victory seeks applause. Steadiness seeks peace. And for the first time since that holiday dinner, I knew that whatever happened next would unfold on terms I had chosen for myself. In the weeks that followed, something subtle began to change, not only in my relationship with Daniel and Ashley, but in the way I carried myself through the world. December arrived with its early sunsets and brittle cold mornings, and while holiday lights flickered across my neighborhood, I focused on preparing for my move in January. I began sorting through the garage, measuring furniture to decide what would fit into my new one-bedroom apartment, and scheduling a moving company for the second week of the month. Each practical step felt like a quiet declaration that my time and energy belonged to me again. Daniel called more often after his visit, sometimes just to ask how I was feeling, sometimes to mention small details about work or the children, as if he were relearning how to speak to me without assuming I would automatically fill in the gaps of his life. Ashley remained polite but distant, her messages brief and careful. A few days before Christmas, she invited me over for dinner. I could sense the tension beneath the invitation, the unspoken hope that things would simply return to how they had been. I arrived with a small wrapped gift for each grandchild and a calmness I did not have a month earlier. The house looked the same, but I did not feel the same walking into it. I no longer saw a place where I needed to prove my usefulness. I saw my son's home, separate from mine. During dinner, conversation stayed light, focused on school projects and holiday plans. At one point, Ashley thanked me for everything I had done over the years, her tone measured, and while it was not an apology in direct words, it was the closest she had come. I accepted it with a nod, neither magnifying nor dismissing it. After dessert, Daniel asked about my upcoming move, and I explained the amenities at the community, the fitness classes, the walking paths, the book club that met twice a week. I spoke about it not as a retreat from family, but as a step toward independence. I watched as understanding slowly replaced surprise on his face. When I left that evening, the cold air felt less harsh than it had on Thanksgiving night. I realized that setting boundaries had not destroyed my family. It had clarified it. Respect, once spoken aloud, has a way of reshaping the room. And as I drove home beneath strings of white lights hanging from porches along my street, I felt something steady and warm settle inside me, the quiet confidence of a woman who finally understands that love does not require self-erasure. The second week of January arrived with gray skies and a thin layer of snow covering the sidewalks. And on moving day, I stood in my nearly empty living room and listened to the echo of my own footsteps. The movers worked efficiently, wrapping furniture in thick blankets and carrying boxes labeled in careful black marker, while I held onto a small container that carried the most important things: family photographs, your father's watch, and the updated estate documents that represented a quiet turning point in my life. When we pulled into the senior living community, the brick buildings looked warm against the winter light, and I felt a surprising sense of anticipation rather than sadness. My new apartment was on the second floor with a small balcony that overlooked a walking path dusted in white. It was not large, but it was mine, chosen deliberately, paid for without hesitation. That first evening, after the movers left and the last box was stacked neatly against the wall, I sat in my new armchair with a cup of chamomile tea and let the silence settle around me. It did not feel lonely. It felt intentional. A few days later, Daniel and the children came to visit. The grandchildren ran down the hallway, curious about the community library and the indoor pool, and their laughter filled the space in a way that felt natural, not obligated. Daniel looked around slowly, taking in the clean lines of the apartment, the framed photographs already placed on the shelves, the sense of order. He admitted that he had not expected me to move so quickly or so confidently. I told him that sometimes strength shows up later in life, when you finally decide to use it. Ashley came the following weekend. She brought a small potted plant as a housewarming gift and complimented the view from my balcony. There was a carefulness in her tone, but also something softer than before. She asked how I was adjusting, and I answered honestly that I felt lighter. I did not mention the cleaning list. I did not need to. The shift had already happened. Over the next few weeks, I joined a book club that met every Tuesday afternoon and signed up for a watercolor class on Thursdays. For the first time in years, my calendar reflected my interests instead of everyone else's needs. When I visited Daniel's home after that, it was as a guest who arrived by invitation and left by choice. I noticed that Ashley no longer spoke about what I could help with. Instead, she asked about my classes, about the friends I was making, about the stories I was reading. Respect had not arrived through confrontation or anger. It arrived because I removed myself from a position where I was taken for granted. And as winter slowly gave way to the first hints of spring, I understood that dignity is not something others hand to you. It is something you claim, quietly, and then protect with steady hands. By the time spring arrived in Ohio, the maple trees outside my balcony had begun to bloom, and I found myself looking forward to mornings in a way I had not in years. I developed a routine that belonged entirely to me. I would wake up at 7, brew a fresh pot of coffee, and sit by the window with a book from the community library while sunlight slowly filled the room. On Wednesdays, I attended a financial wellness seminar offered in the main hall, and it was there that I decided to finalize one more change. I scheduled a follow-up meeting with Mr. Henderson to formally establish the scholarship fund at the local community college in your father's name. It would support 2 students each year, covering tuition for those who needed a second chance at education. When I signed the documents, I felt a deep sense of alignment, as though the years of sacrifice had been redirected into something purposeful rather than expected. A week later, I invited Daniel and Ashley to join me for lunch at the community dining room. The tables were set with simple white linens, and sunlight streamed through tall windows overlooking the garden. After we finished our meal, I shared the news about the scholarship and explained that my estate plan now reflected charitable giving as a priority. I spoke calmly, without accusation or drama. I told them that whatever remained would be distributed thoughtfully, but that my resources would no longer function as an unspoken guarantee. Daniel listened carefully, his expression serious but respectful. Ashley nodded slowly, absorbing the information without interruption. There was no argument. There was no scene. There was only the quiet understanding that the balance of expectation had shifted permanently. Later that afternoon, as I walked them to the entrance, Daniel squeezed my hand and said he was proud of me. It was a simple sentence, but it carried more sincerity than I had heard in a long time. When they drove away, I did not feel distance. I felt clarity. Our relationship no longer rested on obligation or assumption. It rested on choice. That evening, I attended my watercolor class and painted a small landscape of trees in early bloom. As I blended soft shades of green and gold across the paper, I realized that the most important lesson I had learned was not about money or property. It was about value. When you allow others to define your worth by how much you give, they may never see the cost. But when you stand quietly and define your own boundaries, you teach them how to treat you. I am still a mother. I am still a grandmother. But I am also a woman who understands that dignity is not negotiable. And in claiming it, I did not lose my family. I finally found my place within it.